Good afternoon and welcome to the second lecture of computer vision. Today, we will start as usual with a quick revision of what we did last week, and then we will continue today with chapter 3 and continue with chapters 4 and 5. So today, we will work all our way up to object recognition, and next week, we will then look into neural networks as one approach to solve a lot of computer vision problems, including object recognition. Last week, we looked into what the field of computer vision is actually all about. We saw some examples of how we deal with computer vision every day. We talked a bit about the organization of this course. And I received a few emails with questions about the projects. I don't discuss this yet because in order for us to talk about projects, we need to advance with the content first. So I'll say more about the lectures, about the projects when we're ready for that. Right now, I don't think it would adequately help us to advance with the course by talking about the projects. But in a few weeks' time, we'll be talking about projects. We also compared computer vision to image processing. We saw image processing is actually something quite different than computer vision. Nonetheless, we use image processing techniques in computer vision. And we saw that computer vision is actually the exact opposite of computer graphics. We saw various questions that may come up when we design computer vision systems. And we looked at a couple of images of perception that are ambiguous for humans as well as for machines. We talked about different levels of vision. So far we've worked on low-level vision. This time or today we will continue with a little bit of low-level vision, but also intermediate vision and work our way up to high-level vision. And we looked at how the human eye works. We saw various challenges of computer science, of computer vision. And then we started looking into digital images. We saw digital cameras, and we saw that we do a discretization in digital images, both in terms of the shape as well as the intensity. And we saw that digital images are typically represented as matrices. And we saw various color models, RGB, HS, X, where X can stand for V, H, I, whatever. These models, we talked about them. We saw this famous Lena image and where it comes from. We saw the impact of noise. Noise is inherent in computer vision, and we saw how we can filter it out. For example, with a local average filter, we saw its pros and cons, and we saw that actually, we're dealing with a two-dimensional convolution, but these convolutions, they come more from signal processing. We don't care too much about these highly generic definitions because we deal with our discrete images. So we don't need to think in terms of these integrals, and we can actually think in terms of sums. And we saw a very convenient notation for these local average filters with this matrix shape. We saw various others of these filters, and we said that a filter can has other terms as well, like a mask, a convolution, whatever. We also looked into edge detection. Concretely, we saw the Sopel operator, and we saw how it works, some examples. We discussed some of its pros, but also some of its limitations. And we saw a code example. And we looked briefly into the Kenny edge detector and discussed how it works, as well as examples. And edges are important because they are one of the fundamental properties in images. Usually that's a change of intensity, and this can be a low-level feature that we can use in vision tasks. And there are many more edge detectors, but we've discussed probably the most important ones. And you can find these more advanced ones or other ones in typical computer vision libraries. Then we started briefly with the next chapter, regions of images and segmentation. And we wondered what segmentation is about, we've seen examples. Our goal is to separate the image into groups of pixels that somehow belong together. And that relationship belonging together can have various means. It could be a color tone, it could be intensity, it could be something else. And from these segments, we can continue working, for example, by classifying them. Classification is something we have not discussed yet, only so far segmentations. We also briefly talked about perceptual grouping and Gestalt theory. It's something how we perceive objects, and maybe some of these laws could be helpful to you when you build vision systems, when you make some assumptions about your data. Today, we will continue with segmentation approaches. We've last week talked about that there are merging algorithms, there are splitting algorithms, but also other approaches like segmentation by a histogram. So the histogram is a statistics of our image by counting how many pixels have which intensity, and based from there, we could try to come up with various thresholds in order to segment this image. We've seen some pros and cons, and once we add salt and pepper noise, all of this gets more difficult, as well as lighting also severely complicates all of this. And this is how far we worked last time. If you have any questions about what we discussed last week or the course, you can just raise your hand now here in Zoom or send your question in the chat. I'll be happy to discuss them. And if there are any questions, there are no hands raised. If there are questions, just send them in the chat as usual. There are various other segmentation approaches that we will discuss now. Before we saw that, for example, there are merging and splitting algorithms, but we can also have combinations. A combination that is quite well studied is a so-called quadtree. A quadtree not just appears in computer vision, it also sometimes appears in computer graphics for various problems. And with a quadtree, we try to do a decomposition of an image. Here we can use it for a segmentation, and it's actually a combination of merging and splitting, because it initially it tries to split the image into smaller parts and then merge them together into coherent parts. And this can be done with this tree approach quite well. It's an algorithm that is overall studied very well, and there are efficient implementations of it. So in case you need a combination of splitting and merging for your segmentation tasks, maybe take a look at an efficient implementation of a quadtree. Now, I'm very interested in machine learning, and most of you study artificial intelligence, and you're taking this course. So we'll also be looking at a machine learning approach now that allows us to do segmentation. That algorithm that we'll look at now, it's called k-means, and k-means, first of all, has nothing to do with computer vision. It's a classic algorithm from machine learning, concretely from unsupervised learning, and it allows us to cluster a data set into various cohesive clusters, where the K in the name stands for the numbers of clusters. And just introducing my notation is we have m many observations or data points. A data point is called x, where x is a vector because it can be multiple dimensions with an index I. And we have m many of that, and we want to cluster that data set into k many cohesive clusters, where k is less than or equal to m. Typically, k is much smaller than m for a lot of settings. And each cluster will have a mean mu j. And that's the center of the cluster. We'll now look briefly at that algorithm. Maybe some of you have studied that algorithm before. If you have seen k-means before, maybe send me a, I don't know, green sticker. If you have not seen it before, a red sticker. Guess quite some of you have seen this algorithm before, but we also have students from outside these AI programs who have maybe not seen this. And it's very important. It's a non-deterministic algorithm because initially we need to start with our coordinates of the initial coordinates of clusters, and that's done randomly. So if you run this algorithm on your same data set multiple times, you get different results. I will briefly discuss how that algorithm works, and then we will be discussing the algorithm on a couple of examples, and then we will actually apply it to a vision problem. And what we have is, so we want k-many clusters, and each cluster has a center or a mean, which we call mu, and there are k-many ones, and it's a vector because, again, our data points, they may be multi-dimensional, so is the mean then. And there are k-many of them, and we do a random initialization, so they are somewhere in our data space. And then I'm doing a loop, an outer loop, until convergence. And in the outer loop, there are two inner loops that follow sequentially. What I'm doing in the first loop is I go through all my data points, which is I from 1 to m. I go through all my observations, and I have then a variable c with an index I, and I will assign every data point to the cluster that is actually the closest to my data point, because there are various clusters, and one of those cluster centers is the closest to my data point. So I say for every point in my data set, what's the nearest cluster? And then I'm going through my k-many clusters. So I use a different variable j from 1 to k, and I calculate the mean of that cluster from all the points that are assigned to that cluster. Then I'm continuing this outer loop. So first of all, assigning data points to a cluster, and then calculating the mean of a cluster. And I keep doing this until convergence. Convergence typically means I don't change any of the assignments of my data points to a cluster anymore. And then I'm done. It's a fairly easy clustering algorithm, probably one of the simplest ones possible. And we will now look at an example of why this algorithm, or how this algorithm works. So what I have in here is it's a two-dimensional data set, but imagine it can be far more than 2 dimensions. And I have my data points, which are these gray entries, and I have 3 clusters. I have a red cluster, a green cluster, and a blue cluster. If you're colorblind, you may be struggling with this distinction of these two, but later the colors are actually just supplementary, so you can also see this figure well without colors. So what we're doing now in our first step is we're assigning each data point to the nearest cluster. And these cluster centers are random because we've just randomly initialized this. And then I know, well, this green point belongs to the red one. Sorry, this gray point belongs to the red one. While I have this point here, it belongs to the green one, and so forth. So I'm assigning each point to the nearest center of a cluster, and I see this in the next figure, and I see which points I have assigned to the green cluster, which points to the red one, and which ones to the blue one. This was the first inner loop, and then the next inner loop is updating the mean of the cluster. For the red one, it's fairly easy because we only have 1 point assigned to the cluster. So we're actually moving this mean from our old random mean to the mean where that 1 point is located. For the green ones and blue ones, we are updating the mean based from all these points that are assigned to them. So we see that the green mean moves a little bit as well as the blue mean. And then we have finished the first iteration of the outer loop, and then we're doing the next iteration of the outer loop, and we're then assigning again each point to the nearest center. We see now that, for example, this red cluster has grown a little bit. It got 2 examples. These are the examples assigned to green and to blue. And then we would be doing the next step, meaning we would be updating the means of these clusters. So the red cluster would be, for example, would have its mean there. The green ones were here, and the blue one probably stays more or less. So this is what we're doing, and you keep doing this until convergence, meaning that all of these points are fixed to a cluster and their assignment does not change anymore. For most real-world use cases, k-means converges relatively quickly. K-means is fairly easy to implement. So for this, you can obviously use a library like scikit-learn, but you can also try to implement it on your own. And we will now see other clustering algorithms, and we will see a more complex data set. This data set here I found in Wikipedia. What it looks like is more or less a Mickey Mouse. And I have the data set initially. There are no real clusters from the data yet. But what we would notice as humans is if we say this is a Mickey Mouse, there's a green cluster, which is this hat. We have a red cluster, which is the one ear, and the blue cluster, which is the other ear. Plus, we have all these outliers that are hard to assign to any of the clusters. But outliers are a reality in real-world data sets. And now, if I apply k-means clustering to that, and I assume that my clusters are randomly initialized, and they are randomly initialized quite okay, let's assume this, then I would get that I have this blue cluster, I have the green cluster, and the red cluster. And what I notice is, if I run this for quite a while and it converges, this doesn't look too great. The 3 clusters are maybe not that useful. The blue one is maybe quite okay. The green one, however, is not. It's just too big. It takes a lot of data from the red cluster. Plus, we see that these outliers are also assigned to the clusters, always to the nearest centroid. And these centroids are also visualized here. You can see this big X. You can see a big circle and a big plus, and these are the centers. So overall, looks a little bit okay, but not too reasonable, I think. And the reason we don't get a very good clustering here, or that would fit to our expectation, is because that's how k-means works. K-means always assumes that my clusters are in a circular shape, or in a higher dimension, it would be a spherical shape. And that's what k-means simply assumes from the way I calculate these distances, because I always pick the nearest one. At least this would be for a distance measure, like just the distance in space or the distance between 2 vectors. Or 2 points. That's what I would do. I could also use other metrics in this algorithm in order to calculate distance. So it doesn't always need to be just the Euclidean distance, but it could be some other distance measure. And if you, for example, use k-means from a professional machine learning library, often you can also pick the distance measure. So it's not always just Euclidean, which is the distance just in the space, but you could pick other distance, like the cosine distance, whatever. And depending on your use case, that may actually be useful. But here we just assume the Euclidean distance. And the result doesn't look too great. Then there is a different clustering algorithm. It's the EM clustering algorithm. And the EM clustering stands for expectation maximization. Expectation maximization is an algorithm that comes from signal processing or statistics, and we heavily use it in machine learning for all sorts of models. We can use it for clustering. We can be using it for hidden Markov models and others. So it's not just something we're using for clustering. It's an application of clustering. And this EM algorithm is actually something highly generic. And we're applying it here to clustering. Then we have the EM clustering. And EM clustering is actually, if you study it in depth, also a generalization of k-means clustering. Because the E step for expectation would be the first loop, and the M would be the other step. So EM is a highly or quite a complex statistical technique. We'll be probably looking into it a little bit more in other chapters in this course. But you wonder, why does it give me a different result than k-means? K-means is actually just a specialization of the EM clustering, which assumes spherical or circular clusters. However, if you take a look at the EM clustering, it assumes something different. EM clustering assumes that your clusters have a shape of an ellipsis. An ellipsis in 2D, 3D, 4D, whatever. So it's not circular, but an ellipsis. And with that assumption, we can actually get quite good clusters with the EM clustering. And we see the clusters make a lot of sense. What we still have are these outliers, and outliers are still here assigned to the nearest center of the ellipsis. If you want your outliers to be ignored, you would actually need a completely different clustering algorithm. For other kinds of shapes where circles or ellipses are not the right ones, you could look, for example, into an algorithm that is called dbScan. I'm just sending the name here in the chat. dbScan is a far more complex clustering algorithm. If you have just more or less arbitrary shapes of your clusters, that algorithm works well, but it again adds complexity, and it also requires far more running time. So I hope this gave you a little bit of insights into the difference of k-means and EM clustering. These kind of clustering algorithms, they are implemented, for example, in scikit-learn, so you can easily use them. Plus, they have lots of parameters like distance measure and other things. Give a try at them. One issue that both of these algorithms have is you need to define from the beginning how many clusters you want. So you would say, I want 3 clusters in this data set, and either k-means or EM will find you 3 clusters. But it's you who needs to pick the number of clusters. It's not up to the algorithm. So this requires your expertise of the data, and you need to make that assumption. And based on that assumption, it will either give you a good result or a bad result. And I also said it depends a lot on these random initializations, especially with k-means, because if you run k-means multiple times on the same data, you will probably get a somewhat different result. And for both algorithms, you need to pick the number of clusters manually. There are also other clustering algorithms, like a hierarchical clustering approach. They would try to estimate the number of clusters that actually make sense for your data set. Something like this can also be found in various machine learning libraries. We will now see that we can also use k-means for image compression. Before we study that, I want to discuss with you a little bit how you would compress an image. Say you have an image with a certain number of colors. How could you compress it? If you have any suggestions, without now discussing the k-means approach, because this is something I'll be showing you, maybe let me know in the chat. So you have an image with, say, 1,000 colors or 10,000 different colors, and you want to compress it. One student here recommends PCA. For the one who recommends PCA, so the principal component analysis, maybe send this in the chat of how you expect this directly. One student recommends the Fourier transform. Yes, that's also one way. Maybe you can explain a few more details in the chat, or turn on your microphone of how you would do this. One student says remove every second pixel. Okay, we would just remove every second pixel. So we would make the image smaller in terms of the size, and then only need half of the space, for example, or if we take every pixel, or if we take every pixel in terms of the rows and columns, could be even a fourth of the size. So depending on how we interpret this, yes, we could do that. One student recommended a principal component analysis, one the Fourier transform. You're also welcome to send this in the chat. If you have more suggestions of how you can compress an image, also let me know. But what we could do is we could just try to reduce the number of unique colors. Say we have an image and we have 10,000 unique colors in there, and maybe we can just have 10 unique colors to represent the image quite well. Because what we're doing in a traditional color digital image, we save these 3 channels per pixel, for example, in RGB, and we store these 10 integers per pixel. It could be just a byte and then per color channel. So we would have 3 bytes per pixel. And then we maybe have 10,000 unique colors in our image, but maybe we can just make the image look nice in, say, 100 unique colors. And then we would not be storing anymore the unique or the color directly in our pixel image, but rather in every pixel, we would just store a reference, and the reference would be, you know, maybe just a byte or less, depending on how we represent it. And that reference would refer to our color map. And in the color map, we are storing these unique colors. So it would be a compression in terms of the number of unique colors. And it could actually lead to a massive speed or massive reduction in memory if we can efficiently just store a reference to our pixel or to our color map. And we just have a couple of unique colors rather than 10,000 or 50,000, whatever. Now the question is, how do I find a good way to represent this in terms of unique colors? There's some code. We'll be discussing the code later. But what we're doing here is we have this image. And in this image, in fact, we have 96,000 unique colors. It's a very nice image. And we could just randomly pick 64 colors from these 96,000 unique colors, and then assign every color that we didn't pick to the nearest color we had randomly picked. So we had 90-something thousand unique colors throughout these pixels. We just pick 64 random ones, and then for each pixel that is not from one of these 64 colors, we just try to map it to the closest unique colors among the 64. And I picked them just randomly. And if I compare this was the original image, this was the random ones, doesn't look too bad, I think. It's obviously a loss of quality, but I can store this much more efficiently because I don't need to be storing more than 90,000 unique colors, just 64 unique colors, and in each pixel a reference to the nearest of those 64. Maybe just send me a thumbs up if you understood that concept of our color map and the reference to the color map, or maybe a thumbs down if that wasn't clear yet, because it's important that we get that, but I only see confirmation from you. Now, rather than picking colors randomly, we could sort of pick the best 64 colors so that we have as little loss as possible in the image. What we essentially just need to do is find a good way to determine 64 colors so that when we have all the other pixels mapped to one of these 64 nearest colors, we have as little loss as possible. This was the original image for 96,000 unique colors. And if we do that with machine learning, so we find some algorithm that determines us the best 64 colors, we get this one. So this is the original. Now we have that one. So I think overall, the compression worked quite well. Obviously not perfect. If you look around the sky, and around the water. But if we look at this tower, it doesn't look too bad. Very little loss. What do you think? Do you think overall that's a good compression? If you see any, you can also maybe turn on your microphone or send in the chat maybe what you like in this compressed image and what you don't like. I've already mentioned a few points that actually look good. And there are other points that maybe don't look that good, but we heard here already in the chat that it looks good for this, for one student. More comments are most welcome. And one student sent me a direct message about how to compress an image in terms of the number of pixels. The approach that the student described is exactly the one we're now doing, because we need to find somehow these 64 colors in a reasonable way. And rather than just guessing them randomly, we can be using machine learning. And there's a code example here. And actually, that's a lot of boilerplate code that we only need that it works. What we're using is scikit-learn. There's a k-means algorithm for clustering. There's the sample image, the one you have just seen. We also need matplotlib to visualize this. We need NumPy to work with matrices. And there's a lot of boilerplate code. There is a function that is called recreate image. We'll be looking later at what it does. And there's a compress image, which compresses our image. And we also have a function to plot our image. And what we're doing is we load the sample image from China. I say I want 64 colors left. I compress my image with those 64 colors or 264 colors, and I plot the image. So my key function is compress image. What compress image does is it loads the image and turns it into a NumPy array. And essentially what it's doing, it's now decomposing the image into some way that we can easily work with it. But you're welcome to code this example on your own because it's just a lot of boilerplate code. The essence is we have our k-means algorithm, which we imported from scikit-learn. The number of clusters that I'm passing is the number of colors. And I'm fitting the k-means on not the whole image, but actually I'm taking a sample from the image. So this image sample is just 1,000 pixels from the image. So it just runs a little bit faster than if I ran k-means on the whole image, but that's just a speed up. You can test the difference at home, whether the speed up is significant or not, or if you can easily run it on the whole image. But if the image is too big, maybe it just takes a little bit. But this is just essentially what we're doing is I have turned the image into an array. So I broke the matrix into up, that I have one array, and from this array I'm shuffling and I take a random 1,000 pixels, and then I fit my k-means. So I'm running the k-means, I'm doing the training for these 1,000 sample pixels for 64 colors. And with the predict, I'm doing predict on the whole array, meaning I'm predicting for each pixel the nearest color. And there's a question, why are we doing shuffling? Because my goal is I just pick randomly 1,000 pixels from the whole image, and we had transformed the image into an array. So I can shuffle that array and just take the first 1,000 entries. So like this, I just take a random 1,000 pixels from the whole image. There are obviously other ways you could implement this, but I think with shuffle, it works quite well. But this is just a speed up. I could also just leave it aside and do fit predict on the whole image, just to speed up. And with predict, I'm predicting the closest color or the closest centroid, so the closest cluster for each pixel in the image. And then what I'm doing with recreate image is I'm just recreating the whole image. So I'm passing these cluster centers, and so I had this array, and I just want to build from the array a matrix again, but also taking into account this code book, and this code book are just these centroids. So what I want is just the color of that cluster, and I want that one applied to every pixel accordingly. So that's just a lot of boilerplate code to do what I just explained. You can try this out for maybe 10,000 random points, for 100 random points. You can see if this leads to a major speed up, but here in this case, at least if the image is large, it provides quite a speed up, but you can also try to run it without the speed up. It's just a speed up, which reduces obviously the result quality, or the quality of the result a little bit. But I think for 1,000 random pixels, it's overall quite okay. So this is what we're doing. We have the original image. We converted it to this image, and now we can try to compress it further. Rather than 64 colors, I can pick 10 colors. So 10 out of these 96,000 unique ones, they're now not just random points, but I have applied k-means to that. And based from data, these are the 10 colors for which my overall loss is the lowest. For 10, still doesn't look too bad, I think. Instead of 96,000 unique colors, we still got some color here. We can still see something in the background. The sky obviously isn't too great. Maybe for 20 unique colors, it would still look far better. I don't know. You can try this out. For 5 unique colors, I still get something like this, but it's still, in terms of the optimization, the best colors that I can get, so that the overall loss is the lowest. And for 2 colors, I just get this binarization. So now you have seen how we can compress an image based on k-means, a machine learning approach. So you see that the various approaches to segmentation in this course, we've looked at tree methods, we've looked at histograms. One other approach is using clustering for segmentation, and here we use segmentation in order to compress an image. For segmentation, there are also neural networks that you could use. For example, some students investigated this last year in their projects. So neural networks can be used for all sorts of problems in computer vision. But there are good reasons that we not just discuss neural networks in this course, because neural networks, they also come with lots of new challenges. And we'll see those when we discuss neural networks in the next lecture. So this was the chapter on regions of images and segmentation. And as usual, if you have questions, just raise your hand here in Zoom or send your questions in the chat. Like the question before, why do we do shuffling? I answered. You can also always raise your hand and use your microphone. You're most welcome to do this. And today we are focusing on feature detection. Features are essential low-level properties in images, and from them we'll do a lot of further work. For example, for a lot of machine learning approaches, so that's what we will be doing in object recognition, we need features from the data. We cannot work too well on raw data, and from features we're doing learning then. Neural networks, they also self-learn features, and that's why we do neural networks after we have discussed feature detection. But it's not like you can replace all computer vision just with neural networks. That's why we still need to discuss how we can actually find features in images. And concretely, we're discussing 3 algorithms today. The first one is RANSAC. It's a highly generic machine learning algorithm. It can be applied to feature detection in images. It can be applied to lots of other problems. Then we'll be looking at the Hough transform. It's an algorithm for computer vision in order to find us lines in images, which are features. And the Harris corner detector is another approach that finds us corners. because corners are also very distinctive features in images, and based from these features, we can do learning of certain concepts, and we do the learning based on features. So what is actually a feature? We've now used this term a couple of times. A feature is an interesting part of an image. And features are important because we can learn from them or use them in other tasks. It is obviously not just machine learning in computer vision, and plenty of other algorithms as well. And these features, typically a lot of feature detection algorithms, they're quite efficient. So we can calculate local features efficiently. Can be helpful for real-time performance. There are obviously some feature detectors that are quite slow, but we'll be doing a distinction here as well. Oftentimes, there are many features in an image, and they're somewhat redundant. And local features can be used in order to build more global features. So you can build also a hierarchy of features. And local features are typically associated with local or with objects in a scene. So overall, it's desirable that we learn features. There can be lots of different features. For example, edges are features. This is something we had already seen in one of the previous chapters when we used, for example, the Sobel operator or the Kenny edge detector. They find edges. Lines are other features because edges, they're not necessarily straight. They have some shape, but lines are straight. Corners are very distinctive. And then there are lots of other features like plops, ridges, whatever. And we can, as I said before, use features, for example, in classification, in learning tasks, but we can use features for many other things. Not just in learning, for example, for object tracking. Obviously, you can do object tracking with learning as well, but you can also use other algorithms. You can match images, compare images based on features. You can use this to detect objects and so forth. So features are important. And while it first of all looks, maybe easy to calculate features, computer vision is messy, and we've seen lots of challenges in computer vision in the last lecture. For example, illumination, noise, and so forth. And detecting features is also sensitive with regards to noise, illumination, and lots of other factors that contribute. So what we actually want is a certain invariance to various factors that can complicate feature detection. For example, we want this to be robust to lighting variations, because if you vary lighting of a scene or an object, if features change a lot, this will probably be quite difficult. Lighting can contribute to noise. There are other factors to noise. Also, your camera can add noise. There can be blurring, maybe if you don't have enough focus when you take the photos, and so forth. But there can be other variances. For example, translation means if you have an object in an image, it's not always in the same position, maybe not always in the center of the image. Maybe it's shifted a little bit left or right, up or down. So this can be a variation. You can have rotation, meaning the object may be rotated. You can have scale, that's the distance of the object from the camera. And if you take lots of photos of objects, there's always that sort of variation in it. Translation, rotation, scale. And ideally, we want a feature detector also to be invariant to translation, rotation, and scale. Because maybe we don't want to care too much if the object is very close to the camera or further away. I just want the same features. If the object is not always in the center of the image, but a bit left or right, I still want the same features if the object is rotated, plus all these other factors. That's my hope, but we will see that that's not always the case. We will see now various feature detectors, and we will see what they are invariant to, what they are robust to. and we see some of them are maybe robust to the one thing, others to the other thing, but it's hard to find a feature detector that could handle all of this very easily. The human eye can handle this to some extent quite well. We've talked about human vision and human brain in the last lecture. But now when we build artificial systems, we also need to take all of these factors into account. And that's not that easy, as you will see. For example, lines are very important. We said straight lines are a feature that we want in our images. And in fact, many objects in a scene, at least artificial objects, maybe not, in some natural objects like trees, for example, they're characterized by the presence of straight lines or relatively straight lines. So detecting lines can be very helpful for a lot of computer vision tasks. When we start with straight lines, and then maybe we have this feature, and then we can build more high-level features from lines. And you're probably wondering, why am I not just running edge detection? We saw edge detection last week, but these edges that we found, they are not necessarily straight. And they are actually just single pixels. They're not one structure, but we have pixels, and some of them are an edge. Sometimes these edges are interrupted, sometimes not, and they're definitely not always straight. So if some parts are missing or they're not fully straight, probably it's quite difficult to start working with edge detection. Edge detection can be, depending on my use case, a pre-processing step for finding more high-level features, but just doing edge detection is probably not enough. We will now be looking at an algorithm that we call RANSAC. And RANSAC is the random sample consensus. And RANSAC is a general machine learning algorithm that allows us to estimate parameters of a mathematical model from a set of observed data. And that data is noisy, so we have outliers. And what we want are that we can handle these outliers to some extent. Before we look at the RANSAC algorithm, how it works, I have an example here for you. We have our data set, which are these points, including these 2 points that are already highlighted red. And what I want to find in here is, I want to find a straight line in this data set. But it's noisy, so there's not just data of the straight line, but there's more in it. And with RANSAC, I would randomly pick initially some of these points. If we apply it to line detection, we would pick 2 points, first of all. And then I try to put a straight line through that, which is step 2. And then I have, obviously, I need to bear in mind that these pixels that I want are maybe, or these, say, these features that I have there that could represent a line, they're maybe not perfectly straight, and there is some extra noise in it. So I could look around a small corridor outside this line, how many points actually fall in. And there are maybe 2 points that fall in, but many don't. So these 2 random points that I found here are maybe not a good indication for a straight line. So it didn't work because these inliers within this corridor, there are not many. But I can now just start from scratch, randomly pick 2 other points in my data set, which are these 2. I put a straight line through, and then I have this corridor again, and I see many points actually fall in. These 2, this one, but the outliers don't. There are a few outliers, but not many. They don't fall in. So I see that this guess here is actually probably much more useful. And what we have just done is one application of RANSAC. And RANSAC is obviously more generic because it's not just for straight lines, but for other mathematical models as well. I will randomly select a so-called seed group of points. We have seen the seed group, which were those 2, for example, for a line. I would compute my transformation from a seed group. The transformation here would be a straight line. I would look at how many inliers there are for this transformation. And I would check, so this is something I would call voting, because I would vote how many of these inliers fit in. And then I would check if the numbers of inliers is sufficiently large, depending on some threshold I would be defining. And if it's not the case, I would just maybe redo the whole thing with two different, or with a different seed group. And I would stop that loop once I'm actually happy with a seed group that I found and enough inliers for the transformation. So I would do this multiple times and then stop at some point when I'm happy. So concretely, I would actually pick the transformation with the largest number of inliers. That's the idea of RANSAC. You can apply this obviously not just to finding straight lines. You can apply this concept to many other problems in machine learning, and it can handle noise quite okay. If there's too much noise, this approach obviously doesn't work very well. So if I have much more noise scattered around here, then probably my RANSAC is not working too well. So the pros of RANSAC is, it's first of all a general method. I can apply this to lots of other model fitting problems. It's fairly easy to implement this in code. It works okay for a moderate amount of outliers, but if that percentage of outliers goes up, it will be probably more difficult to handle this with RANSAC. And we'll be now looking at a different algorithm that is not that generic, but it's an algorithm purely made for finding lines. It's the Hough transform, and this one can actually handle a super large number of outliers. There's again a lot of text in these slides, and I keep saying this. I think I said this last week already. There's a lot of text in slides. I don't read this out. It's essentially for further reading or a quick summary of what I'm discussing here in this chapter. But the Hough transform is an algorithm that allows us to find lines very well. And the Hough transform was initially proposed only for lines where there's a lot of noise. It's a so-called voting procedure. We'll soon see how this works. And in addition to this classical Hough transform, over the years, more and more Hough transforms for other shapes, not just straight lines, were proposed in order to handle those shapes, such as circles. I have an example here of images. And what I want to find is essentially straight lines in this image. So this is the original image, and this is my result. So I found various lines in here, but obviously these lines are far longer than actually the objects, so they go too long here. What I'm seeing here is actually a step-by-step procedure of how the Hough transform works. And probably you're confused about images 3 and 4 because they look like some hair. This is actually just a different representation of our pixels and lines in a different space, in a so-called R theta space. And we'll be looking at this R theta space now, and we'll see how this Hough transform works and why it can actually handle extremely much noise and still deliver relatively good results, like in this image. Even though there's noise and all sorts of strange problems like illumination, whatever, it still works fairly well. I have to tell you, when I studied computer vision, I struggled understanding the Hough transform in my first go, because the professor who taught it is a very good professor, but I just struggled to get what all the Hough transform was about and how it worked. A few years ago, I actually found this or a set of figures or a set of images with an example. And that example, I think, describes the Hough transform extremely well. It's still difficult and it's quite a few tough steps, but with that figure, I think you will more easily understand what the Hough transform is about. My image looks like this. I have an apple, and this apple is probably in on the floor, and behind there's the wall. So we have this straight line here, which is just the edge between the floor and the wall. And I have this apple here, and there's also some shade of the apple. Now I want to find the straight line. And this will be probably quite difficult, say, with RANSAC, because most pixels I have in this image are for the apple. This shade also creates a lot of pixels, but there are not that many pixels for my straight line. And the Hough transform allows me to handle this. One of the first steps I'm doing is I want to detect edges. And last week you learned how to detect edges, for example, with the Sobel operator or Kenny edge. And in red, I have now visualized some of the edges or some pixels of edges that the edge detector found. It's just simplified with these red dots. Otherwise, the next image we're looking at can hardly be visualized. So this is what an edge detector found. Obviously, some edges here around the straight line, around the apple, but also around the shade. This is the first step of the Hough transform. And what I'm doing now is I'm looking at each of these pixels that came from the edge detector, like this one, and I want to describe it in a different space. I want to describe it in the so-called R theta space. What I'm doing is I'm trying to take this edge and I put various straight lines through it, like this green straight line or this blue straight line. These are all lines that go through the first pixel. And these lines can be described with a single point in a so-called R theta space, because I have my center and I can try to describe from the center my green line or my blue line. Concretely, with a distance, so for example, R2 is the distance of the green line to the center. If I assume I have a 90-degree angle here, and then R2 is this distance, plus I also have an angle that I call theta 2. So this is theta 2. It's the angle of the line from the center that intersects with the green line with a 90-degree angle. So this is then R2 and theta 2. I also do this for the blue line. And for the blue line, I have a distance that I call R1, and I have an angle that is theta 1. Now I can try to plot these R theta elements in a new plot. I have a plot that has on the x-axis, on the first axis, a theta, and on the other axis an R. So my straight line that went through my first dot can be described as a dot in the R theta space. So the blue line is one dot in R theta, and the green one is a green dot in R theta. So each dot in R theta describes a straight line that went through my first point. Now I can try to put a lot of straight lines into my first point. And each of those straight lines that went through my first point can be described in R theta space. All of them. And what I will get is eventually some curve that looks like a sine. For example, I have this red one here that goes through my first point. It's in R theta. I have the blue one from, well, we had this green and blue one before. There's a dark blue one. And each of these straight lines is in R theta space. And then I have this sine curvature here. This is only for the first point. Now I can repeat or I've done this for the first point, and all these points in here are straight lines through the first point. And I can try to interpolate this, and concretely, this one here is an interpolation through these points in r theta space. And what I see in this plot with this function here, it describes every possible line through the first point or first edge in the original image. Now I can do exactly the same procedure for the second point of the edge, for all the other points from edges in the original image, and I will get a lot of these functions in the r theta space. Remember, for example, this one here, this function would describe all the straight lines through some other point in these edges. And what I see is in this r theta space, if I have these curves, they're intersecting. Up here, I have one intersection. Up here, maybe 3 are intersecting. But I somewhere have a point where I have the most intersections in r theta space. And this point here, in which I have the most intersections, that's a point in r theta. And remember, a point in r theta is a straight line in our original space. So I can take that one point where I have the most intersections, and I can try to map this back to my original space. And it actually turns out that would be, so this point where I have most intersections in r theta, that would be actually that straight line in my original image. I know it was a lot of steps and tough, and that's why we quickly do it again from the beginning, all the steps. And I should be clear. I have my original image. I put edge detection in it. I get here, it's just a few red points for simplification. For a point, I take all possible straight lines, the first straight line, the second one, the third one through my first point. Each straight line gives me a point in r theta. If I put all the possible straight lines through my point, it gives me one function in r theta, which looks something like this. And I repeat that procedure for all edge points in the original image. Then I have a lot of these functions in r theta, and I calculate where they intersect, and where I had the most intersections, that's one point in r theta, and one point in r theta is one straight line in the original image, and that's the straight line I was looking for. Do you feel okay now with the Hough transform? Maybe thumbs up, thumbs down. I know it's a tough algorithm, but I think with this example, it actually becomes quite obvious how it works. The Hough transform has some pros and cons. I will start with some pros. The Hough transform can handle noise extremely well. Even if there's far more noise than proper data, the Hough transform can handle this extremely well. What do you think could be some downsides of the Hough transform? Maybe raise your hand and turn on your microphone. I'll be happy to also hear you. If you have something you want to be contributing in the chat, you're also most welcome. What do you think a limitation of the Hough transform could be? I'll give you a moment and see if the original line detection is bad. So you mean if the original edge detection is bad? Yes, if that's bad, then probably the Hough transform will be bad too. That's correct. Any other suggestions what could be an issue of the Hough transform? I don't see comments from you. One big problem of the Hough transform is running time. The Hough transform can be quite slow, especially because if I apply an edge detector here, so I got this now computation. If I run edge detection, I obviously get much more edges than just these few points. And then for each point, putting all the possible lines into r theta, and then trying to intersect all of this in r theta. So this can be computationally quite heavy. And you obviously have to make some approximations for all of this. Otherwise, your computations will just never end. So running time is an issue, but you can handle noise very well. But yes, it all depends on the original edge detection. When I did my master's, computer vision was actually a big part of this. I once implemented the Hough transform on my own and it worked actually quite okay. But it took me a little bit to get it working, both in terms of that the results were fine and the running time. But I'm just still very happy that I once implemented the Hough transform on my own. I didn't see this in projects so far in this course. There were some students using the Hough transform, but they used an efficient library that implemented this. But maybe someone also wants to try this in projects this year and try to implement the Hough transform on your own and make it working on sufficiently interesting and complex data. So that's the Hough transform. The Hough transform is obviously very invariant to rotation, to translation. Noise is also handled well. Scale to some extent. If you scale out too much, so you're too far away, then maybe the edge detection doesn't work too well anymore. But rotation and translation can be handled quite okay by the Hough transform. Then there's a question, how do you get the slope of the line that passes through that intersection one? So with the intersection, I guess you mean this one here. How do you get the slope of this? The slope, you have to calculate it back because what you have is an R and a theta. And remember, R and theta looks like this. So for R and theta, you're actually describing this straight line. So from R and theta, you can directly, with this 90-degree angle, infer the line and you can visualize it. So overall, that's quite straightforward. So this is the Hough transform. And today, we will be spending quite a lot of time on one feature detection algorithm that I personally like a lot. It's the Harris corner detector. And we will not just look at an example, but we will actually derive it step by step from a mathematical point, how it works. The idea is the following. I have this calculator here, and I have marked 3 example regions in here. What I want to find is corners. Corners are extremely distinctive or they make objects distinctive in an image because, or we'll look at why. Imagine I have this calculator and I just take a look at a small region, which is here. And that's a very uniform region. It's quite dark. There's maybe a little bit of variation in the intensity because I have some illumination on this plastic, but a feature from here doesn't give me much. A better feature could be this line here, for example, because a line is some sort of border of something. And you've just seen how we can actually calculate lines with the Hough transform. But corners are even more distinctive because they don't refer to a line, but only just to ideally some very small point that is a very distinctive one of an object. And if I try to find corners, I need to take into account the following considerations. If I have this non-distinctive region and I put in some small window, there isn't much variation in here in terms of the intensity. But for a corner, I have a lot of change of intensity in these 2-dimensional because this is quite sharp and gives me a proper or quite a change of intensity in these pixels if I put a window on that small region of pixels. And we can now try to find corners in an image by using the so-called Harris corner detector. This part of the lecture, I will also use the whiteboard, my iPad more for, and it will be quite mathematical, and we'll need quite a few mathematical tools, but we will also revise them as needed. For this, I will switch to my iPad. And what we are now doing is we're using, or we're deriving the Harris corner detector. So, and all I'm deriving is also in the slides. So in the slides, it's well formatted. But since this is a couple of slides, plenty of maths, I don't just want to show you the slides, but actually derive it. So we have a window that I call W, and a window is a small part of the image that I can move around on the image. And there are a few pixels in the image. And I can shift this by a vector D. So D should actually be in bold, but I cannot write this too well in bold, or I could, but in the slides it's formatted properly. And D is a vector UV. In the slides, the vector is written in the slides. I have this vector written as a row vector, but here, because we have more space on the iPad, we can have a column vector, but it's the elements UV, and I have a column vector, and I can represent a column vector as a row vector just with a transpose. And what I want is I have my window that I can move around in my image. And the images are all now grayscale images. And I have a function E that describes an error. And what I'm doing is, or some value, yeah, we could call it an error or just a difference or something. Maybe difference sounds better. And I have my window, and remember the window is a small number of pixels in my image, and I move this window around, and I can go through all the pixels in the window. And the first, and each pixel has a coordinate X and Y. And I want to calculate a difference in here and then square the difference. And what I need is a function I, which is the intensity of the pixel XY. Remember, the intensity is a value between 0 and 255, where 0 is black, 255 is white, and in between we have a grayscale. And this intensity at XY, we will now think about a window that we're moving around, and we're moving around the window by this shift D, and I have my X and my Y, and I add U on top of X and V on top of Y. So this shift is something by which I'm shifting the window. The window and U and V can also be just a few pixels. And when I shift this window a little bit around just by UV, where UV are small, the intensity here will somehow change compared to if the window wasn't changed. And I have this sum here because I'm doing this for all the pixels in the window. And this will give me a difference. So the intensity will be maybe the same if I move the window a little bit, or the intensity is more or less. And what I often do is such a square difference. So the square difference is then 0 or positive. So I have a positive difference or a negative difference. I square it. I will have always a positive difference, or 0 if there's no difference. And larger differences get much larger than small differences. So that's the idea of such a squared error function. And I'm going through the whole window, and I call this E for error, or I could also D for the difference by shifting the window, but we already have a D. That's why we call it an E. Are you all okay with this definition of this function so far? So because it's very essential you understand it, so maybe thumbs up, thumbs down, that I know if you're okay with this definition. I haven't seen much reactions yet, so maybe send me some more reactions that I also see that you're still here. Yeah, good. More reactions now. We will come back to this Harris corner detector in a moment, but we need something in between that we call now, or is a helper tool. And the helper tool is our Taylor expansion. The Taylor expansion is something you learn in a calculus class. Who of you still remembers the Taylor expansion of a function? There's a hand raised. I guess that's what you remember. Maybe everyone sends a thumbs up or a green sticker if you remember the Taylor expansion, or a thumbs down, a red sticker if you don't. Largely positive responses, but some who don't remember it, and that's fine. So if I have a function f of x, the Taylor expansion is, or the Taylor polynomials are an approximation of the function. And what I can do is, if I want to know that function at where x is a, so we can say x is a, so for a concrete value a, I want to approximate this function around there. And what I can do is I can say, well, that's f of a plus, I take the derivative at a and divide it by 1 factorial, which is just 1, and I say x minus a plus the second order derivative at a divided by factorial of 2 times x minus a squared plus the third order derivative at a divided by 3 factorial times x minus a to the third, dot, dot, dot. This can be written in a more generic way. Concretely, I can say this is the sum where n is 0. I can do infinitely many steps. I say this is the nth order derivative of f at position a, or for value a. I divide by n factorial and I multiply x minus a to the n. And these Taylor polynomials, they become a better approximation of a function when n increases. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we'll be looking at one example. Concretely, we'll be looking at this now, how we can actually approximate the function cosine. For cosine, we know that f of x looks like this, and we'll be now calculating a few derivatives of this. The derivative of cosine of x is minus sine of x. The next derivative, or second order derivative, is minus cosine of x. The next derivative, so third order derivative, is sine of x. And then the fourth order derivative of x is cosine of x. And now we apply the Taylor approximation, so we can actually approximate cosine. And you will see, or approximate it at a. this will be a little bit to write now. In the slides, as usual, this is written down in a very neat way. And so the approximation of cosine x is, and we assume that we know what's the value of cosine and the derivatives at a. We'll later use a concrete value for a. So I write a in green, sorry, in blue. So cosine of a, this is this part here. So f of a is the first part of the approximation. And then we take the next one, which is the first order derivative of a, or of f at a, divide by 1 factorial times x minus a. We have a minus here because we have the cosine, and then we have the minus in the sign, so that's why we have a minus here. We say sine at a, I'm writing in the a in blue in a moment, divided by 1 factorial times x minus a. Then the next order derivative part is minus cosine at a divided by 2 factorial x minus a squared. And you see we'll continue now with the third and fourth order derivative, but I will keep this probably a bit short. In the slides, I do this up to the fourth order, but here in this example, so I need to write it out, we'll keep it to the second order derivative. So I write plus dot, 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 because we can do this with infinitely many steps. And now I say, I want to put a equals 0. So I put a 0 wherever I had put in my a. And we'll write this out again. So cosine of x is then cosine at 0 minus sine at 0 divided by 1 factorial. So x minus 0. And then we just wait a second, my pen didn't work. Struggling a bit with the pen. Then minus cosine at 0 divided by 2 factorial, just x minus 0 squared plus dot, dot, dot. And now we can try to simplify this. Because we know that cosine at 0, so this one here is 1. Sine at 0 is 0. This one is also 1. And we can try to simplify this now. So we can say that this is 1 minus, this part is 0. So all of this up here is just 0 because I put a 0 in the numerator. And then the last part, I had this 1 in the numerator. So it's 1 divided by 2, because 2 factorial is 2. And then it's actually x minus 0 squared. So it's x squared plus, plus, plus. We just write it out a little bit nicer. So it's 1 minus x squared half plus dot, dot, dot. So what I have actually just built is an approximation of the cosine function through these Taylor polynomials. in order to get a better approximation, I should put in a few more steps, and I'll show you this briefly in the slides. So this is all what we had just discussed. The Harris corner detector, we'll get back to it in a moment. We have looked at the Taylor expansion, and here I've done this for more higher order derivatives for the third, fourth order derivative. And I fill this in, and eventually this is an approximation that I get for the cosine function. This is something you have seen in an introduction to calculus. You can also apply the Taylor expansion to function in several variables. There's a big example, or this is the big definition of what this would look like for several variables. I'm not going to write this out. It's something you can find as a reference on the internet. We don't need it to that kind of detail. And you can do a Taylor expansion in several variables here through an example. But this example is also quite, takes you a little bit to follow it. And we will now actually apply the Taylor expansion to our Harris corner detector. So I'll go back to the Harris corner detector. And I just want to know from you, there were a few students who said they had not been familiar with the, or they were not familiar with the Taylor expansion. So maybe the ones who were not familiar with Taylor expansion, you can just let me know if you're okay with the Taylor expansion now. Maybe with a thumbs up or something, because you should have seen now how the Taylor expansion works. And we can go back to our Harris corner detector, because this is not the part where we actually need the where we need the Taylor expansion, because this is our Harris corner detector, and I actually want to simplify this a little bit. In particular, I have this yellow term, and I want to apply a Taylor expansion to it. And what I can then do is I can write out, so the intensity at x plus u and y plus v is the intensity at xy. So this is something you will see if you apply the Taylor expansion to functions with multiple variables. We've only looked at the examples at one variable, but we've looked at this very general definition with multiple variables. And then we can see there are more parts because there are infinitely many parts. The next ones would be actually, we take the partial derivative of I, so the intensity function, along x, so these are partial derivatives, times u, plus a partial derivative of I along y times v, plus ... many higher order terms. So this is the Taylor expansion of our intensity window that is shifted. And what I care about now is only the first three parts. So I'm highlighting this in red. So I eliminate the higher order terms, and I only care about these first three terms. And I plug them into where I had the intensity window shifted. I'm going to write this out. So in between, we have this Taylor expansion. And now I can say, well, my error function by shifting along uv is not exactly the sum anymore, but it's approximately a sum where I have x, y in the window. And I have this error from before. One part didn't change. It's the intensity at xy. So this is just the part from before. And where I had this intensity shifted, I'm going to plug in these terms from up here. concretely, this is the intensity at xy. Then I have a partial derivative of I along x times u plus the partial derivative along y times v. And now the error is approximately this. It's not exactly this because I have left out these higher order terms, and that's why it's an approximate sign. And what we can notice now is I have this I here and I subtract it, so I can just eliminate both. As it's the intensity and then I subtract it. So what is left now is only these two parts. And these two parts, we will now write them a little bit more conveniently, so we don't always need to write partial derivatives. Concretely, I'm defining a variable ix, and ix is this partial derivative of the intensity along x, and iy is the partial derivative of I along y. And then I can just write in a simplified way my error uv is the approximation from before. xy is in the window, and I apply this ix and iy that I just defined here to make it look more neat. So I take the u from above, so this is the u from above, and I write times ix, because the ix is this partial derivative, plus v comes from up here, times this partial derivative iy. So I have this I add these two terms and I square it. So no fundamental changes. Now I'm gonna break up this square up here and I just write it out, and then we're making progress step by step, and we will soon be at the end or near the end of the Harris corner detector. So xy in the window. And rather than squaring the sum, I write it out now. And what I get is a u squared times I x squared plus 2u v ix iy plus v squared times iy squared. It's all written in a slide for you. Now I have written out this sum, and I can actually simplify this in terms of a matrix decomposition, because this sum is for all the elements in the window. And I can, rather than the sum, I can write EUV is approximately a row vector UV times a bigger matrix times a column vector UV. And in this matrix, it's a 2 by 2 matrix. I sum up the ix squared in the first element. In the last element, I sum up the iy squared. And then in the other two elements, so that's the diagonal, and in the other two elements, I sum up the sum of ix times iy, and this is also the last element is the same. So this is a matrix decomposition of the result, what this sum would give me. And what I can now say is this one here, this element, or this last column vector, we call D. So the first one is a D transpose. So I have the column vector and the row vector. So one is just the transpose of the other. And this matrix from up here, I call M. How to do this decomposition in detail, just trust me that this decomposition looks like this. We don't try to do the decomposition here. It's just something you can find in the literature. Are you still okay with up to here? Maybe send me a green sticker or red sticker if you're okay up to here. If you have questions, you can always let me know, obviously. But I think we've derived this now step by step. And if there are any typo or any minor mistake I wrote here, which may happen by accident without noticing, just check in the slides. There's typeset extremely well, and also typeset in a probably nicer font than my handwriting. Now, I want to know from you if you remember the concept, because now, again, we have an interruption, because we now have this matrix decomposition here, and we need to do something with this matrix decomposition. Who of you is still familiar with eigenvectors and eigenvalues? Maybe thumbs up for you're familiar with eigenvectors and eigenvalues. Thumbs down if you're not familiar with this. But I only, well, okay, one student is not, or some are not. That's why I will explain it. And I got a private message just for one student who wants to know what is actually, again, this EU. EU is, I have my window and I shift it by UV. And finally, how big is the difference of the intensity in the window if I shift this pixel by if I shift the window by UV many pixels. So the window is small and I just shift it a little bit by UV, and then I get a difference of the intensity. And we had started with this sum, and then we had that, well, we cannot work with this sum here so easy. So we have done a Taylor expansion to approximate it. And from there, we have simplified it and broken it up into a matrix decomposition. And this matrix decomposition will actually give us something extremely valuable that we can notice when we look into eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And since there were some of you who are not familiar with this, there's no problem. We will actually be looking into this now. So we'll be studying or repeating. So it's not an in detail introduction. It's a revision of eigenvalues and eigenvectors of a matrix. We have a matrix A, which is an n times n matrix. And it may have multiple eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And what we can say is we take A times a vector x, where x is a non-zero vector, so that's important. And we have an equation with lambda, that is the same as lambda times x. And what we say is that our lambda is an eigenvalue, and x is the corresponding eigenvector. So we have for eigenvalue, we have a corresponding eigenvector, vice versa. And we will now see what this is actually useful. It's very important. Not all matrices, not all square matrices have an eigen or have eigenvalues and eigenvectors. There are all sorts of interpretations what eigenvalues and eigenvectors are useful for. We can look at an example. So we have, say, in 2D, we can wonder what this concept could look like. So I have a vector that I call X. So, but this should be a bold X, also up here, because all of AX should be bold because it's a matrix or a vector, but in the slides, this is formatted well. And maybe just in order not to mix up the X's, we could say, we simplify this and write this is dimension x1 and x2, so we don't mix up the X's. And I have a vector X, and if I multiply it by a matrix A, of which X is an eigenvector, then the direction of X does not change. So we have X, and if X is an eigenvector of A, and we multiply A times X, then the direction of X does not change, but its length could change. For example, if the length doubles, then the corresponding eigenvalue could be 2. Right, like lambda would be 2 if the length of the vector doubles when multiplying it with A, but the direction does not change. This could be a geometrical or an interpretation from a geometry perspective. Eigenvectors, eigenvalues have lots of other interpretations depending on what you use them for. What can change is in fact the direction, but just in the opposite direction. So for example, if something would then happen, so we multiply X with A, then lambda here would be minus 0.5, because we saw it's only half long, and what the result, and it points in the opposite direction. So this would be for an eigenvalue of 0.5. That's just the opposite direction, minus 0.5. So just in the opposite direction. But the direction cannot change otherwise if X is an eigenvector of A. And now you're wondering how you can find eigenvectors and eigenvalues. I will show you one example. And again, this is something that is discussed in detail in a linear algebra class, because this condition from up here can be rewritten. So this is our condition, and we can try to rewrite it. Concretely, we can say that A minus lambda times I, where I is the identity matrix, times X is 0. And this is the 0 vector. That's why I put it in bold. It's all formatted properly in bold in the slides. So this is the identity matrix, n times n. And remember, for the identity matrix, it's all 0 except the diagonal, which is 1. So one example could be here, just the diagonal is 1 and all the other elements are 0. This is what the identity matrix looks like. So lambda is multiplied by the identity matrix. And now we want to find the corresponding eigenvectors or the eigenvectors of A and the corresponding eigenvalues. We need to solve this system of linear equations in order to find them. And it's very important, not every square matrix has eigenvectors. If an n times n matrix has eigenvectors, there are n of them. But sometimes there are also some cases that eigenvectors of a matrix are orthogonal, for example, for symmetric matrices, and there are all sorts of details, but this is not important for now. But rather, I'll show you one example now of how we can find eigenvalues and eigenvectors of a matrix. So we have, again, an example. And the example is A. The matrix could be like 2, -4, -1, -1. And I want to know what are its eigenvalues. And what I need to know is the so-called deterministic or the characteristic polynomial of A. And I want to have its determinant. So this is often written as the characteristic polynomial. It's the determinant of. What I do is I take my matrix, as we have shown here before, but I'm subtracting lambda times I. And I is the identity matrix. So it means I'm subtracting lambda in the diagonal. So the non-diagonal elements, they're not affected. So the -4 and the -1, they're not affected. And I have my 2 and my -1, and I'm subtracting in the diagonal lambda. So I'm writing here minus lambda, and I want to know the determinant of this. And the determinant of a 2 times 2 matrix is the element in the diagonal, first element times the other element minus, so we take a product of those minus the product of the 2 other elements. And we can try to write this out. So it's 2 minus lambda times -1 minus lambda. This is the first product. And we subtract the product of -1 times -4, which are the 2 other elements. And I can write this out, and eventually it gives me something like lambda squared minus lambda minus 6 from my notes. And I can write this as a factor, which is lambda minus 3 times lambda plus 2. So I know that the 2 lambdas, in order to solve this, so to say for the characteristic polynomial, that I have a 0, because that's what I put up there in the condition. So lambda 1 is 3 and lambda 2 is -2. So now I have found the 2 eigenvalues of this matrix. And the question is, how can I find the eigenvectors? I will just show you this in the slides, so I don't need to read it out or write it out. Just a quick overview of the slides. This is what we had just done. What is an eigenvector, eigenvalue? With a little bit more text for your revision. We had put this condition and we had tried to solve it. That's exactly what we just did. And in order to find the corresponding eigenvectors, there's an eigenvector for the eigenvalue lambda 1. We can put in this lambda 1, which is 3, into this matrix as before from this characteristic polynomial. And we can try to solve the system of linear equations, which you're welcome to try at home. And eventually we will see that for this system of equations to be solved, the solution solution would refer to multiples of this vector -4 and 1. And this would be the corresponding eigenvector for this eigenvalue. You can also do this for the other eigenvalue, which was -2. The solution would be, or it would describe the eigenvector, which are multiples of 1, 1. So 1, 1 and minus 4, 1 are now the eigenvectors, and we have the corresponding eigenvalues. And you're wondering now, why did we do this revision? Because we will now go back to our Harris corner detector, and probably I'll just show you the slides so I don't need to write this. Remember, this is the last point we were at with our Harris corner detector, because we said this error by moving the window could be described in terms of this matrix decomposition. And we can try to investigate this now. In fact, for our matrix decomposition, we had this matrix M. We can wonder about its eigenvalues. I'll just show you the matrix again, because we said we had this matrix, which is one of these 3 parts of the matrix decomposition, because we have our D, which is just a shift UV. One is a column vector, the other one is a row vector, and we have this matrix M. And it's a 2 times 2 matrix, so we can try to find its eigenvectors, eigenvalues, if it has them. And we can then calculate a so-called measure of corner response. And this measure R is the product of the 2 eigenvalues of the matrix minus K, or sometimes this is a kappa, times a sum of the 2 eigenvalues, and the sum is squared. And this so-called corner response can be an indication if there is a proper corner or not in our window, if we shift it a little bit. This K, which is sometimes a kappa, is a constant that depends a little bit on your use case, but is often a small value between 0.04 to 0.06 empirically. And as we have this window, and we need to shift this window, or we have the window and we need to put it at a lot of different points in our image in order to find potential corners. This is quite computationally expensive, because I will have a lot of windows spread throughout my image, and I need to find all these decompositions and then calculate the eigenvalues of M. This will be computationally expensive, so what is sometimes done instead is that we approximate the corner response, not by looking at the eigenvalues, but in practice we're computing the corner response by saying we take the determinant of M. Determinant is just something we had done before, minus K times the trace of M squared. Who of you knows what the trace of a matrix is? If you have heard about TR trace, maybe thumbs up or thumbs down if you have never heard about the trace. And the ones who know what the trace is, because one student said he or she remembers the trace, maybe turn on your microphone and tell us what the trace is, or send it in the chat and share your insights, because you're the only one who responded about the trace. Since I'm waiting for you, I guess you're typing it in the chat, but again, you're welcome to turn on your microphone to share this with us. And I'll give you a moment to let us know what this trace is. I didn't get the response here in the chat, so I'll say the trace of a matrix is the sum of elements in the first diagonal. So this is the trace. And now I got it here in the chat from you. Yes, so this is the sum of elements in the diagonal. And this corner response can be approximated quite okay if we don't want to calculate the eigenvalues. The eigenvalues, if you combine them or calculate in this way, is shown that it's actually a good measure for the corner response. In one of the next few slides, we'll also see why. But again, this is difficult to compute, at least at a large scale, because we have a lot of windows that we need to spread over the image. So approximating it like this is certainly cheaper. Why do we need the eigenvalues? And this is also one question we got here in the chat. What can be shown is we have sample windows in here. And we see, for example, one sample window which refers to a relatively uniform area in here or here. What we see in there is we have a visualization of if within this area we have a window, a small window, we move it around, we see here a distribution of our eigenvalues along. We see the eigenvalues, and the eigenvalues are in fact relatively uniform for such a uniform area. But if we take a different area where we have concrete corners in it, for example, in here we have quite some corners, we see that our eigenvalues are large. Both eigenvalues are large if we have corners in it. However, if I only have like straight lines in it, like in this part of the image, only one of the eigenvalues is large and the other eigenvalue is relatively small. Taking this into account, you can calculate this corner response like this, because you have the product minus the product of k times the sum squared. And if you mix up or blend the two eigenvalues in this way, you can actually calculate a corner response by taking advantage that in a proper corner, actually, both eigenvalues are large, and around a straight line or something like this, only one of the eigenvalues is actually large. The other one is small. And if you have some relatively uniform patch or a patch where you don't really have corners, then both eigenvalues are small. And this can be also shown here with this plot or with this figure. Corners typically mean both eigenvalues are large, while for edges, typically one eigenvalue is much larger than the other one. And for a uniform region, both eigenvalues are relatively small. This is the idea of the Harris corner detector. You can also apply it to sample data, and this was done here in this figure or in this image, and it detects quite some corners well. One challenge is obviously like thresholding and all of this. The Harris corner detector is overall quite invariant to rotation and translation. Scale can be an issue because, again, if an object is very, very far away from the camera, you may just not have enough pixels in order to find corners very well. However, if you zoom in too much, it may deliver you a lot of unnecessary corners. That's why here the thresholding plays a particular role. But overall, a Harris corner detector is quite a good approach to find corners. There are obviously much more detectors that can find you corners. But the beauty of the Harris corner detector is that that concept can also be derived during a lecture, as we have just done. Feel free to try the Harris corner detector. You find it in quite a lot of computer vision libraries, but you've also seen all the tools now of how to calculate it yourself. We've done a few equations that you can implement. Actually, what you need to implement is something like this. You calculate matrix M, and you do the necessary prior steps that we have seen. You have the matrix M, and then you need to calculate the determinant, or you can start with if you want to calculate the eigenvalues, you can do this from M. You don't need to write that code for your own. You can just use a library for linear algebra, like NumPy. It can or there's all sorts of other libraries available for linear algebra that will return you the eigenvalues, and you're done. If you don't want the eigenvalues, you can just do something like this, the determinant and the trace, and you subtract the one from the other, and you also get an approximation of the corner response. Feel free to try it out on an image on your own and try to visualize them. I've implemented this a few times. It's something relatively straightforward. Just if you have a huge image and maybe small windows and you just shift them around very small, probably this could get at some point quite slow. So make sure you use linear algebra libraries that have implemented like the calculation of the eigenvalue efficiently, so you don't need to do it on your own. In addition to that's what I just discussed. In addition to the feature detectors we have seen today, so we have seen RANSAC, we have seen the Hough transform, we have seen the Harris corner detector. There are more. A very, very well-known feature detector is SIFT. SIFT stands for scale invariant feature transform, so it gives you good features from an image, even scale invariant to a large degree. The problem with SIFT is the paper is extremely complex to read. Feel free to read the SIFT paper. I don't know, it's maybe 20 or 25 years old. I don't know. Reading that paper will be quite tough, and it's something we can hardly discuss here in an introductory lecture in a couple of hours. There are more feature detectors like the histogram of oriented gradients, the different of Gaussians, and many more. Feel free to check these feature detectors. Probably you don't need to understand them in detail or code them from scratch, because again, they're available in plenty of libraries. Now that we've studied feature detection, we're seeing that we're advancing slowly towards higher level vision. We've started in this course with pixels and filters, which is very low level. We've seen also how we can detect some low level features, for example, edges, maybe some little bit more high level ones like corners or lines. We've discussed how we can break an image into various segments. Now we want to use all of this in order to detect objects, because a lot of computer vision tasks we use is some sort of object recognition. Will be in this chapter, so this chapter will be relatively short because we look at various approaches to object recognition. And then we're actually laying the groundwork for working with convolutional neural networks on our data. In this chapter, we start with the challenges of object recognition, and we will see some simpler approaches like template matching, histograms, machine learning. Machine learning is nowadays the hot topic for object recognition. Machine learning has lots of advantages, also some new challenges. And then we have all that groundwork for working with convolutional neural networks in order to recognize objects. What I often notice, and is probably confusing to a lot of you, including me, is that the term recognition can sort of mean many different things if you take a look into the literature. Sometimes people mean something like a classification. Sometimes people mean other things. So object recognition is sort of a general term, but it's used in a very different way throughout the literature. And I'll try now to bring some structure into different terms like recognition, classification, detection, and so forth. Those definitions that I'm using, it's just one attempt at defining them. I have to be honest, I don't use these terms consistently. And they're not binding. It's just my approach trying to bring some order into these terms, because I noticed that they're used quite inconsistently in the literature. And actually these terms like classification, detection, and so forth, they address different problems. And they all here in this course fall into the problem of object recognition. So recognition is more like a general term. A classification would mean to me, at least in this attempt now to define all of this, that I have some object in an image and I want to classify the image based on that object. So here I would classify that there's a dog. That's a dog. I don't try to locate a dog or locate multiple objects. I just have an object. Ideally, the object is the main part of this image, and I classify that's a dog. And this is probably one of the easier tasks in object recognition, because it's something that can actually be solved very well now for the last 15 years using deep learning. I just need enough training data, and I give this image a label, say a dog. I train the neural network on lots of these images of various classes, and then I try to predict on new images. Localization is something a little bit different. Localization means I'm not classifying the whole image into something. Rather, I try to locate the presence of objects, or maybe not just one object, but actually multiple objects in that image, and I try to indicate that location with a bounding box. So it's a different task. Classification was classifying this whole image. We say dog, or cat, or car, whatever. But localization means I try to put a bounding box around it. And this is already more difficult because the object could be larger, smaller, it could be translated, rotated, and so forth. So there are lots of invariances that already complicate localization. And building, say, a neural network for a task like this is still possible, but certainly more challenging. Then detection means something even a little bit more complex, because I'm not just trying to locate the presence of objects, because concretely speaking, in localization, I just try to locate the objects. I'm not really classifying them yet. Here I said before it's a dog, but strictly speaking from this definition, localization means I just locate objects and put a bounding box around it. And detection would be one step further, because I'm not just putting a bounding box around objects, but I'm also classifying what's in that bounding box. So in this example here, we have located two objects and then we classify them independently. So, and then we give them a label. So this is a cat, this is a dog. So now we've seen all these terms, they are often mixed up in the literature, but now we've tried an attempt at classification is classifying the whole image. Locating is locating objects, maybe not caring too much yet what is that object. And detection would be locating and classifying what's within this bounding box. It's just one attempt. If you talk to others, they may mix up these terms in a different way, but all of them are for me now object recognition tasks. And object recognition in general is complex, because there can be lots of issues, first of all. There can be all sorts of noise, for example, in images. We can have scaling of objects. So in some objects, in some images, these objects are smaller or bigger. We can have rotation. Translation, again, means that they're not always in the same location of the image, but could be more to the up or top, bottom, left or right. Deformation of objects could be an issue. Internal camera parameters. It can happen. You take you take a photo of the same scene with two different cameras and you get something somewhat different. Some cameras, for example, give you slightly different colors. Other cameras, they maybe turn straight lines into some curved lines. Or not, it's not a line anymore, but some curved shape. This can happen based on the camera. And then if you collect training data from lots of different cameras, this can lead to problems. You can have occlusions, meaning the object is not fully visible, but it's partially occluded by some other object. Illumination is always an issue in computer vision. You can have viewpoint changes, so you see the object from different viewpoints, and so forth. So this can be a variation within the objects, but you can also have a variation within the class, because you not always just have dogs that have a certain color. You have dogs that have other colors. Maybe a car can have different colors, lots of different shapes. So all of this can lead to all sorts of issues. Furthermore, feature extraction is another issue, because we've now seen how feature extraction works. For example, with the Harris corner detector, the Hough transform. And we see that each of these detectors, they make some sort of different assumptions, and they not always work reliably based on your data, based on the noise you have in the data, and so forth. But we need features for more higher level tasks, because somehow I need to detect a dog or a cat, or maybe start easier to classify them. So what you could do is you could try to find features in here. You could try to find various features, and then either maybe build a rule-based system based on features, or you use features for training a neural network or some other approach. So all of that depends eventually on your feature extraction, plus on all these other challenges. So computer vision is challenging. There are lots of approaches to object recognition. The simplest one could be even some sort of rule-based system in which you try to build rules yourself from some features, but doing that in the wild for arbitrary objects is difficult. So we try to do machine learning, which is the high-end approach, which we'll see soon. But there are simpler approaches based, for example, on template matching, or you can do histograms based on features. We'll see them. There's also an approach to statistical shape models. Statistical shape models would mean you have some sort of template for features, for objects, but you would then be able to customize this, this shape, maybe make it wider, more narrow. This is something that was quite popular in the field of computer vision 10 or 15 years ago. But nowadays we use much more machine learning, in particular neural networks, which comes under the last section. So we're not covering statistical shape models in this course because they have lost importance. And these two other approaches are mainly there to show you that they exist. And for some specific problems, they may actually be useful. We'll look into template matching and say, I want to find an object that is here in this red shape. And template matching could mean I have a template and I just move this template with a sliding window through my image and I try to match it. I can describe such a match in a mathematical way. It just means I try to calculate a correlation where I have the image, which is F, and I have a template that I move through that, and I try to check how much they actually intersect, and I try to maximize this correlation. This is just shown here without discussing this in detail, but I go through the image and I go through then or I move this template through the image and I just try to see where it matches the most. And the template would obviously give me a very high intersection here and not for these other objects. What do you think could be some advantages of template matching? If you have some suggestions, I would also be very happy to talk to you. If you turn on maybe your microphone, if anyone has an idea, what's the benefit of template matching? And we all may, or no microphone, then one student already sent it in the chat. Templates are computationally very cheap because you just go through the image and you try to find some correlation. What could be some downsides of template matching? Any suggestions here? What maybe doesn't make template matching that interesting for various use cases? Because computationally cheap, and I'll give you a moment to think about it. Size can be an issue. Yes, scale, because that object may be smaller or bigger in the image, and then maybe you just don't match it very well. plus these other distortions. Rotation, shadows. Yeah, shadows are a problem. We got a question here, how good that fit should be. So there is maybe some variation in the objects in the image, so they don't match very well with the template. Yeah, so all of these are issues of template matching, but template matching may be useful in a very controllable environment. So you manufacture some items and you want to check them for quality, and maybe they always should have the same size and they always have the same distance to the camera in your controlled environment. Then maybe template matching could be very helpful if you're able to describe that object as a template well, obviously. So describing a complex template could be difficult. One student says it could work well for maybe large images. Well, then it's maybe cheap, but yeah, could be. But large images could maybe also be a problem, because in large images, maybe you have a lot of variation of objects, and then template matching could be difficult. So I'm not totally against template matching for certain problems where you have controlled environments and maybe you can describe the objects quite well. Maybe template matching isn't too bad. And maybe template matching runs extremely quickly, or it could be some earlier step, maybe to make some, to build a trigger or do some pre-selection or something. And based on the pre-selection, maybe you use a more complex model. So that could be an idea of template matching. What you can also try is histograms. Histograms are another approach to object detection, or object recognition in general. What you could do is, for example, you're looking for animals in this image. And possible animals you're looking for is a dog, a koala bear, or some bear. And what you know from your reference images is which features they have. So maybe you apply, I don't know, a Hough transform on them. And for a typical bear, you would have maybe some somewhat straight lines around the legs, the back, while for the dog, you still have a little bit, and for the koala bear, you have less. The Hough transform could be just one example. There could be other feature detectors. And now you want to put in this image here and do object recognition, and you have a sliding window and you move it through there and you try to find features, and all the features you find you count, and maybe you have the biggest overlap of features with your bears from the reference. The overlap is the biggest of our bear and the reference bear, and maybe we have a less overlap of features with dogs and koala bears. And with histogram, you would just sort of count and see how much you have in common, and then you're fine. But this also only works, obviously, if these bears or your objects are not too different from your reference objects, because if they are too different, probably just counting features would maybe not be too useful. But can be an approach, again, maybe for a somewhat controlled environment. And if you can easily calculate features and then count them, do it. Don't always just aim building a big deep learning system or neural network, which may be helpful for very complex problems, but it also comes with a computational cost and more complexity. So maybe histograms and template matching can still be useful for certain problems. And that's why we briefly discussed them in this course. However, in recent years, we see more and more computer vision systems that are based on machine learning. Because with machine learning, we can learn from example data, and we have a goal of learning patterns in a training set, and we try to generalize from this training set. And then we're trying to recognize objects in new images. The goal of machine learning is not just learning patterns in the training data, but ideally to generalize. So we don't just want to repeat the same data we had trained on and then predict on that, but we want to generalize to unseen data. And if we have a lot of variation in our data, or a lot of variation within objects, within the scene, lots of noise, then machine learning can in fact be very helpful. There are numerous machine learning algorithms that have been described in the literature. Today, earlier, we looked at k-means, which is a clustering algorithm. And there are many more machine learning algorithms. For example, k-nearest neighbors is a classifier. Support vector machines are used or were used in the past a lot in vision for classification. You can even use them for regression with an amendment, and so forth. There are decision trees and many other machine learning models. However, a lot of machine learning models, they only work well if you pre-calculate some features from data. Some machine learning models, they work okay on raw data, but if the raw data is maybe just pixels, then a lot of machine learning models don't work very well, because if you feed a huge pixel image, so a huge matrix, into a decision tree, it's very hard for a decision tree or a support vector machine to generalize, because you have all these issues like translation, noise. And if the object can be just somewhere in the image, it will be very difficult for a decision tree or a support vector machine to learn anything useful from that raw data. For some cases, again, where it's a controlled environment or you can make some assumptions, this may work at least a little bit. But for many machine learning problems, you cannot always just work on the raw data, and you can particularly not do this in image data. So what you need to do is you need to pre-process your image, and you need to find, for example, features like corners, edges, lines. We've seen all of this. And then you would feed these features into your machine learning algorithm. And you're doing something similar sometimes with sensor data or just tabular data, that you're not feeding the raw data into your machine learning algorithm, but you calculate features, sometimes some averages or some other statistical properties of the data. And that's what you feed into your machine learning system. And with vision, this is absolutely necessary, because you can hardly train a decision tree or a support vector machine well just on pixel values, because they don't mean much. Rather, you need to look also at the surrounding of these pixels, and that's why features are helpful. So you would pre-calculate features, and then you feed the features into your learning system and learn from them. But we've seen all these different feature detectors today, and there are obviously many more in the literature. And the big question is, which feature detector is the right one I should pick? And here comes the big problem. In the literature, it's quite difficult to sort of find the right feature detector for your problem. Something that computer vision has struggled with for many, many years, because it's sort of, best practice or maybe just arbitrary which feature detector could help you. So our hope is we actually don't need feature detection in the first place, but we could actually learn from raw data. That would be the best we could do in computer vision, because obviously feature detectors, they are helpful, and for certain algorithms and certain problems, we need feature detectors. But if maybe for some problems, we don't need that, and we can directly learn from the raw data, then it would be cool. And this is why neural networks have become so important in the last around 10, 15 years. Because neural networks, especially deep neural networks, they allow us to self-learn features from data and then do something with these features. And that works well, for example, in vision, in natural language processing, and so forth, which is very difficult to describe features. So we could try to learn these features from the data and then learn a task of what to do with those features. That's the idea of neural networks. And in the next lecture, we will look into convolutional neural networks. We will start, first of all, with neural networks, and I'll provide you with an introduction to neural networks and how to train them. And then we'll look into convolutions, which are one approach to computer vision of how neural networks can deal with images very well. And we see how to train them well in various selected architectures. And it's very important that convolutional neural networks are not the only approach to computer vision. There are nowadays some professors, they only teach convolutional neural networks, transformers, and all of this. And they are helpful for certain problems, but for other vision problems, they are maybe not too helpful. Maybe you can solve them cheaper or better with other approaches. And that's why we actually spent these last 4 chapters on other approaches. And ideally, or maybe sometimes to get the best results, you combine traditional methods with modern methods like convolutional neural networks or transformers. And this is how you can actually solve a lot of real-world problems the best by knowing how to pick the right methods and how to combine them. We're done with today's lecture. And next week, we'll do convolutional neural networks as one totally new approach for us, and we'll contrast it to the past approaches. And then actually you already have a lot of groundworks to build your own vision systems. Then there are obviously a few more chapters with more advanced topics. But I know it was a lot of content in the first lecture and today. Make sure you revise all of this well so you're able to contrast it to convolutional neural networks. We've also looked at some code examples. Try to code up these examples, or try to code those problems on your own and solve them and see how it works, and try to vary some parameters. It could help you to get a better understanding. And I'll see you in next week's lecture for convolutional neural networks. Take care and enjoy the Easter vacation.